So we're going to look at underpainting, also called grisaille. It's actually an oil painting technique that is more extensive than what we're going to do here. But so grisaille is painting in the shadows and the shadow shapes first, and then adding color layers on top. So with oil painting, you would do it fairly opaquely, and you would do basically about 3 different gray tones from the lightest to the darkest, and kind of go in and map out the different shadow areas. With watercolor or marker, and I'm going to try to demonstrate both of them here, it's a little bit less extensive. Like, you don't do nearly as much blending. You more lay out the basic darkest shadow shapes. And then with watercolor, because there's this sort of wet blurring that happens, and even more so with gouache, usually once you lay the transparent color layer on top, it kind of softens and blurs out the edges of the shadows. So hopefully we'll be able to see that here. Okay, now we are going to work on painting in shadows, or underpainting, grisaille. We can refer to those things in a similar way. As I think you know, like to reuse my paints, so I will use the remnants of old palettes from past shows, and I'll just kind of keep doctoring them. It's a great way to kind of neutralize colors and have complex mixed tones. I'm actually going to be using this little pot back here. I'm just going to show you this right now because I'm going to take this out of the frame so that it's on my right hand. I'm right-handed, so I usually try to keep my paint, my water brushes to the right, and I might keep like auxiliary colors and things to the left. That way when I'm carrying my brush over, I don't get a lot of splash. So I'm putting this palette here right now so you can see it, and then I'm going to move it out of the frame where the water and everything else is actually like over there. So but I'm going to be using this one. I've activated it with a bit of water. This is watercolor, and as you can see, it didn't take long at all for it to liquefy. And I'm going to use this big brush, and I'm going to start by laying in what I think are going to be large, soft shadow areas. I'm going to pick a lighting source. I'm going to, on her light from what is the upper, it's her upper left, I guess. It's my right hand. So if I say there's a lighting source that's maybe, if she were 3-dimensional, coming at her from slightly in front of her and slightly to the side, like the sun, maybe in the later afternoon. That way I can have both cast shadows, which are going to be harder, and soft, graduated shadows that'll pretty much kind of roll over from our left-hand side. So I'm going to start at the waist, because I've got a lot of work to do in there. So I'll start by putting in some of the what would be fairly hard shadows and valleys created by all this gathering. They're going to be more pronounced over here, and then I'm going to lay them in a little more delicately over as I go over to her other side. I'm going to water it down a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this one down. I'm going to pull a few of them down far, actually, and looking at the bottom where I tried to suggest sort of soft rolls that are still fine, as the gathers I drew at the top suggest, but because it's there's more fabric that's kind of spread out around the bottom, they're not going to be these tight little hard shadows that you have at the top. Right, again, the shadow placement tells us the most specific information about the fabric that this is made out of. So if this was made out of something like a stiff denim, it would have more hard shadows, and it would have gathers that stick out further and create more of like a horizontal kick at the skirt, but it would also we wouldn't have this sort of soft shirring that we're getting here. We'd have hard gathers, like it's the top of some curtains or something. I'm gonna go ahead and place a few more kind of largish ones towards the bottom, where I've drawn depressions. Not all folds and gathers are linear, right? And they're not always following like the flow of the fabric, right? But depends. If this is a fairly fluid thing like a chiffon, then actually the fall would be more vertical. If I had something like a crisp cotton or even a satin, the shadows are a little more unwieldy because the fabric is stiffer. So it holds more peaks and valleys even as it's falling. So I'm gonna move on from there and move towards the top. I'm gonna keep using my big brush for now because I'm gonna work on the sleeve. I'm going to have to switch to a smaller brush somewhat soon though, as I move into these smaller areas. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the cuff because that's a tiny little bit of information, and if I work too many shadow shapes and things into a tiny little detail on a garment, it becomes really distracting and it'll make it look like it's a different color or it's like a print pattern or something, and that's not what we want. So that's something also to be conscious of, that there's a line between expressing drapery and fullness and it looking like it's a pattern that's been applied to the fabric. So let's let her dry. We can go in and do more. I would say that's like a first pass. It's possible that we could just paint on top of that once it dries with color. It's also okay to go in with another smaller brush and do a darker shadow layer. I wouldn't normally do that myself just because I need to work really quickly to usually execute a lot of sketches, but we'll go ahead and do that in this one just so we can see. As you might be able to see, the bottom's already fairly dry. The top that I just worked up to is still wet, right? So if I add more pigment or paint into the wet part, it's going to wet blend and it's going to disperse into that pool of wet liquid. Right now I can probably go ahead and work dry on top of these shadows down here with a darker tone without lifting up much of the pigment that I've put down. So let's go ahead and switch to a darker one. Let me test it. Yeah, I mean, and usually when you switch to a smaller brush, it's going to get darker anyway because the pigment is more concentrated on a smaller like density of bristles, right? So even like the same consistency sometimes of paint with liquid, it's going to appear darker with a smaller brush. So now I'm going to be even more isolated in where I place these. So I'm going to really focus on places where there's either really extreme distance from the light source, deep valleys, or cast shadows. There are a couple places I probably should have hit with the darker ones, or with the larger brush as well. So I don't know if you can see how it's sculpting out, right? I mean, the other alternative, and this is also okay, is to paint the shadows on top after you've painted. And I certainly do that quite often, and that's probably, for most of you, more common. And that's fine too. The difference is primarily that if we paint the shadows out first, well, one, we kind of, it's like another drawing layer where we've defined some of the shape and some of the details of the garment, right? And made some additional decisions about the structure and isolation of different shapes that we've created, right? But then also, if we underpaint and then let it completely dry and then put our color layers on top, those color layers then go undisturbed, so they won't get blended up or scrubbed up into a top shadow layer, right? So it's a way of letting the color layer be like really, really fresh and kind of alive, and it won't become muddy in the same way because it's the thing on top, right? So it's going to be a little fresher, and it should be more saturated even if it's kind of watered down. I might go ahead and I'm gonna shadow out her little foot a little bit as well before I forget that it's there. I guess she had another little foot over there, which I can go ahead and give her back. All right, and I'll go ahead and I've given her some fairly large ears, but I'll go ahead and shadow out that side as well. Okay, so I'm gonna let her dry now, and then we'll do just like a really quick transparent layer on top once it's dry to show how the underpainting works. So you could work multiple different transparent color layers on top of it. You want to work kind of quick and fresh, because even with watercolor, if you scrub your brush over it over and over and again, you're probably gonna pull up some of at least the edge shapes that have dried. So the goal is to move kind of quickly on top of it once it's dried. So the shadows I painted were very purposefully painted with a blue base. So that little pot, I'm gonna go ahead and show you here that I used. It's not black, it's actually a mixture of blue, it has a little bit of violet in it, and then I think I dulled it down ever so slightly with a little bit of like green and probably a little bit of like a sepia. But shadows generally are cool. Meaning they lean towards the violet, blue, possibly even green end of the color spectrum, right? Versus warmer tones that are the colors we relate to the colors of the sun, like orange, yellow, things like that. So highlights tend to have warmer tones in them, whereas shadows and if you walk around and look at the way that cast shadows work throughout the day, they tend to be the coolest and the most violet, closest to nighttime. Actually, during the whole sunset period, you'll see them shift from kind of more red violets to then blue violets to almost kind of navy blues into purplish tones, right? So shadows aren't necessarily always darker than midtones, but they are always cooler in the color spectrum, if that makes sense, right? And so you can adjust your shadow tones based on basically what time of day you want it to be in, or how gloomy you even want it to seem to be, right? And or strange. Like you can have shadows that have more of a green cast if you want something that feels a little bit kind of punchy and mod and even a little surreal. So mine are kind of a blue-gray with a little bit of a violet cast to it.